Well, I think it's about time for another How to Get Into video. This video series I love doing as it gives me a little bit more freedom than my worst to best albums do, as I only really want to cover bands that I've really stopped recording. Half of the comments on those videos are, you need to update this. What about all these other albums that they have been produced? So yeah, the worst to best is usually being reserved now just for bands who have a complete discography and they're no longer putting out anything else, but it still leaves the door open for a lot of bands that I really want to talk about that are still pumping out albums, and one of them being The Tangent. So yeah, this gives me a chance to dive into their discography, tell you guys about where to start, where to go, and kind of what to avoid, because like The Tangent's musical discography and musical library is a little bit of a landfill, and navigating it can feel a little bit like when the albums are good, they are amazing. But when the albums are not good, they're not good. So let's kind of shuffle our way through this and talk about these albums. Now, for a little bit of historical context about The Tangent, they kind of got their start in the early 2000s as a little bit of a supergroup, a little bit like it kind of started off as Andy Tellison's solo project for half of his band of Parallel or 90 Degrees, bringing on Guy Manning and Sam Brines into the fold, while also conglomerating half of the Flower Kings with Jonas Ringgold on bass. Then that man can play the bass. Zoltan I can never pronounce Zoltan's last name. Kosors, and Roland Stolt. This lineup was pretty prominent for the first two albums, and they actually were able to bring on David Jackson, the legendary saxophone player from Vandergraaf Generator, which I'm sure Andy was just thrilled with, as the Vandergraaf Generator is definitely one of the major influences for this band. And with a lot of these groups that have a prolific library of music, the musicians change. There is a little bit of a rotating door within the musician work, and Tellison is really the only one that's still with the band, as it is kind of his main project. Like, it is his brainchild, his child, and so he's the main one kind of behind the scenes. And Guy Manning is kind of the only one that's still with the band, or at least had the longest legacy with the band. But yeah, it's been a little bit of a rotating roster, which is really interesting, because you would think with so many different individuals coming on board to lend their skills, each album would sound so very different. But as we'll see as we get into the meat and potatoes of this, they've kind of found their stride. They kind of found what works and haven't really deviated from that all that much, as it is really Andy's brainchild. So with that context kind of bringing us into the fold, the actual music itself is kind of very retro prog. And retro prog, when retro prog was really kind of at its heyday in like the early 2000s, this was one of the first groups that I was aware of that was really mastering the sound, taking a lot of the sounds from bands like Yes and Genesis and Gentle Giant and King Crimson and specifically Vandergraaf Generator, and folding it into the production work and experimentation of today. In some ways, you know, this retro prog is a little bit of a counterintuitiveness. It is a little bit of an oxymoron, because they're not really progressing the music. If anything, they're regressing the music, because they're staying so close to what was being done in the 70s, but it's being brought into this like celebration of that sound. So that's kind of the essence of this. It's very keyboard heavy, very keyboard led. You know, Andy's sound on the keyboard has been found, and it's very rare that he will deviate from that. But bringing in different saxophones, bass players, main keyboard, main guitars, kind of just to fill out and flesh out the sounds. Where to go from here? Like, where to start? So this would be the starting point. These are the albums that you absolutely, if you haven't already, you definitely need to listen to. And there are two, and these are my two starting points as well, and I think it's the perfect introduction to what to expect when diving into the Tangent's discography as a whole. And that is their 2006 album, A Place in the Queue, as well as the follow-up from 2008, Not As Good as the Book. And as with most of these, they are both concept albums. A Place in the Queue is a little bit more of a loose concept album, and you'll kind of notice that running throughout. Most of these are loose concept albums, except for a few where they go into the studio with an idea, with something that they want to play around with, something that they want to chew on for a bit and just kind of see what comes out of that. A Place in the Queue is basically where you fit in society, and kind of how that works out, with standout tracks being In Earnest, the 20-minute opening track, which is essentially all about an aging bomber pilot from either World War I believe World War II, and kind of like having his glory days be behind him and realizing that, you know, when he was within the war that was costing so many different lives, he was a hero. But now he's basically just this washed up old man that really doesn't have a whole lot to live for, and kind of like how that changes over time based on the context of the society that you're in. It is very much, and most of these albums are very much like, we live in a society, but it's interesting to see kind of where they are. The other one is A Place in the Queue, the closing track at 25 minutes, and that's one of my favorite epics, and it is my favorite epic from the band. So if nothing else, check out A Place in the Queue. I love how the actual track introduces you to two themes that get brought together by the end to really play this out. And that's something that I adore on this album. I think that A Place in the Queue is their best work, and it's one that will not leave you wrong, even though it opens and closes with these massive epics. The smaller tracks on here, Lost in London, Do It Yourself Surgery, GPS Culture, Follow the Leaders, they're very proggy in approach. They're, you know, anywhere from 8 minutes to 10 minutes. Do It Yourself Surgery is a very quick, snappy thing that you kind of want to sink your teeth into. One of my favorite tracks is the shorter track of Sun in My Eyes. It's almost like a disco track, all about reminiscing of the better music from the 70s, which is a little pretentious. It's a little elitist. You know, I used to subscribe to that. I definitely do not anymore, especially when, you know, Andy is saying, oh, all the music today is crap and who would ever listen to it? We need to listen to the good stuff from the 70s. I don't know. It's a little bit full of itself, especially when he's saying like, this is the music that we're playing now and it's the good stuff. And we'll get to that in a second. I love the fun aspect of it. I love kind of this juxtaposition of talking about very epic prog pieces with a disco expression. And it's just a really, really fun time. So I love A Place in the Queue. If you start here for the tangent, you won't be led astray. Now we go into the follow-up for Not As Good As the Book, and I love the overall concept of this being the downfall to romanticizing. Romanticizing the future, romanticizing relationships. Basically, Not As Good As the Book is reading about the future in books like 2001: A Space Odyssey, a lot of those like sci-fi, big speculative authors that were just like, this is what's going to be in the future. You're going to have jetpacks and flying cars, very romanticizing the future. And then once we get here, you realize we still have most of the problems from yesteryear, and most of that is realizing how horrible the past was. And it is a little bit spotty as well. Like, this is kind of where you're starting to feel some of the more negative sides. So that's why I recommend checking out Not As Good As the Book, because if this album doesn't bother you and you love everything off of this, you're going to really love the rest of the Tangents discography. But if you're listening to this and you're like, well, I'm starting to get bored, a lot of these tracks don't really go anywhere. I love a number of these tracks. Like Crisis in Midlife, I love for that big crescendo near the midpoint. I love the Ethernet as being this really big and verbose track. Bat Out of Bastillon, it's fine, but I feel like they already kind of did this with Sun in Your Eyes, but still, you know, it's all right. What I really do appreciate is the second disc off of this, the two big epics, 4 Egos, 1 War, and The Full Gummit, A Travelogue. Both of these are brilliant in terms of a big retro prog epic, and these are ones that I highly recommend checking out, especially The Full Gummit. It shows the drawback to romanticizing a person rather than romancing them, and realizing that people have flaws, and when those flaws are not compatible with yours, how it can tear somebody apart. Just those first, 7 or 8 minutes is just jaw-dropping beautiful, and I just wish that somewhere along the line throughout the track itself, it would have had that same beautiful essence. It never gets to the point, but I understand why, because at the beginning of a relationship, it is that romance, romanticizing and romancing the person, and as you go further and further into it, if you're not compatible with it, it gets worse and worse and worse. So I understand the concept of it, I just wish the musical expression was a little bit more. So those are the two albums I would highly recommend starting off with. From there, as a follow-up, I would actually go a little bit further along their discography to my two other favorite albums from them. The first is the one that they released in 2013, which is probably my third favorite album from them, which is Le Sac de Travail, and their 2018 album, Proxy. I love Le Sac de Travail as it is a concept album of a office worker. Essentially, it's the daily grind, your commute from home to the office, the morning, the afternoon, the commute back, and then finally being able to rest. And it's such a brilliant concept that a lot of other artists have attempted to tackle, but it really does show that within the mundane grind, I mean, my past life, I was an office worker, how monotonous it can get, but also where you look to for those just moments of joy, you know, and how you're able to find it. And I really appreciate them kind of tackling this subject, especially because so many of their listeners fall into this category. I mean, especially within the boomer camp, when it would be such a harder topic to tackle as an artist because you're kind of separated from that world and you can't really relate. So I really appreciate that Andy and the boys really tackled this concept, and I feel did a brilliant job at this. I love the fact that the album itself is essentially one full movement of, like, it's one full work split up into different movements, and you have the 5 movements. And I love the fact that it is essentially just this long piece of music that you can just sit down and enjoy. It's very proggy in that sense, and I think this is probably one of the Tangent's major masterpieces in being able to find that expression. Now, at this point in their career, they have found their stride and they have found what it is that the Tangent's music will be, so it doesn't really deviate all that much from the rest of the sounds being found within the Tangent's discography, but at least it gives you a great idea of what they're able to do with different concepts. And again, it's one of my absolute favorites, so if you even start with this album, you're not going to go wrong because it has some of their best music. And the same can kind of be said with Proxy. Even though Proxy within the first stage of this is probably the weaker of all of these, I still love this concept. I mean, Muse kind of did it with their album of Drones, but this whole Proxy thing, and I was so excited about this album because it did feel like a deviation from a lot of the music that came before it. There was a lot more different trying of styles. It starts off with a 16-minute track of Proxy. It ends with a 16-minute track of The Adult Life, and then has kind of 2 shorter tracks. And one of the things that I love about this is that it's a little bit shorter. You do have 2 bonus tracks of Suppers Off and excerpts from Exos Oceans, but even with these 2 bonus tracks, you're still under or just over an hour's worth of music when most of their albums go into about like an hour and 20 minutes. So I like the fact that this one's a little bit shorter, it's a little bit more digestible, especially if you only listen to the original pieces on here, and it provides a brilliant single sit down and listen. The 2 tracks that sandwich Proxy and The Adult Lie is The Melting Andorlian Sky and The Case of Misplaced Optimism, and they're both pretty good. Like, for tracks for Andy that I feel can get a little too preachy, like, I love a good track with a little bit of a political statement behind them. Like, I really do love sticking my teeth into those and like tearing it either to pieces or just getting in there and being like, yeah, we need to stick it to whoever it is, right? But I do feel like Andy can get a little bit too much on his soapbox at times and get preachy and not as fun. This one kind of shies away a little bit from that, so we're not inundated with that quite as much. I still love Proxy, and even though it's the weaker of the four that I've already mentioned, it's still one that I would be able to, hands down, be able to recommend. So those are kind of the beginning stages of. From here, this is kind of like the next step. If everything that I mentioned and you've listened to really kind of tickle your fancy, then it's time to dive into their first two tracks, their first two albums that was this kind of blending of these two other musical groups. The Music That Died Alone, released in 2003, and the follow-up from 2004, The World That We Drive Through. And both of these are really good at showcasing kind of like where retro prog was in the early 2000s. So if you're familiar with the Flower Kings, you know, if you're familiar with Transatlantic, if you're familiar with Spock's Beard, that's the kind of style that we're getting into with these first two tracks. They're not quite a full-fledged Andy project, even though he's the one that's orchestrating a lot of the tracks on here, but it does have some really brilliant orchestration. It has some brilliant compositions within this. It's a lot more dynamic, I feel, a lot more sophisticated as well. I love the dynamics that we have within these first two albums. I don't return to them as often because unfortunately I don't own them physically and you can't find them on streaming services, so they're a little bit harder to come by, but if you can, this would be kind of like the next step of where to go for really interesting a take on the Tangent, especially because these first two tracks are the most unique. Like, none of the other albums quite sound just like this because this was when they were still trying different things, seeing what this project was going to be. From there, I would go to Down and Out in Paris and London, as well as Calm, their releases in 2009 2011 respectively. These two albums are kind of the solided, that's not a word, it's finally been put into stone kind of what the Tangent's going to be sounding like. Down and Out in Paris and London is kind of being touted as an EP, even though it has enough music for a full LP record, and it's good, as well as Calm, but I do feel like this is where that drawback of the Tangent begins. They start to become a little bit repetitive. They're not really going too far off in terms of experimentation of music. They found their comfortable box and they're not really deviating too far out of it. So this is only if you've been really attached to a lot of these tracks and you just want more. And Down and Out in Paris and London does that, as well as Calm. Calm was actually the first album that I was a little bit disappointed in within the band. I remember downloading it and finding a pirated copy of it and just not being all that excited about it. The first track of the Wiki Man didn't really do anything for me in terms of like a big epic, especially with Calm being like our relationship with technology, how it's bad, and like what we need to learn from that. The other like closing big piece of Titanic Calls Carpathia, it's one of the weaker ones. Like, I wasn't all that excited for it, and the mid tracks of The Mind's Eye, Shoot Them Down, and Tech Support Guy, they don't really do too much that hasn't already been said. Shoot Them Down is one of the weaker tracks that the Tangent has ever really done, and I'm not all that excited about it. So this is one that I would proceed with caution. Like, this is one that I would go to if you're kind of excited about the Tangent and everything that I've been saying so far has really like sparked your interest. But yeah, and the same can kind of be said about Down and Out in Paris and London. Where Are They Now, being like the big track for this, is fine, but it didn't really do too much for me. And then the last one, the other ones of Paroxetine, Pedro Dan's Paris, and The Company Car, the other three tracks off of this, they're all right. They're all right, but you know, that's kind of my take on these. It's just, they're all right. They're all right. From there, let's go into those tracks and albums that I would avoid. And it's really interesting because I'm comparing all the scores from the Prog Archives, and these are listed very highly. I wouldn't necessarily subscribe to this. So these are the albums that I would kind of put my flag down in the field and say avoid. And that's Spark in the Ether, The Music That Died Alone, Volume 2, released in 2015. The Slow Rust of Forgotten Machinery, released in 2017. And Auto Reconnaissance, released in 2020. All three of these albums essentially do the exact same thing, and there's very little deviation from these three. There's very little variety that's found on them. Each of these albums have at least one, maybe two big epic tracks that really don't go anywhere, if I'm being honest. Like the slow rust of Forgotten Machinery. How do I even approach this album? Because this one doesn't really have, like, the overarching idea behind this is that, you know, the technology of the current big technology will in the future be those who have basically nothing, their only means of salvation. So when they were developing railroads way back when, that are now being torn up, that's the main communal's walkway. Same with the roads and the highways, but now it's kind of like this digital like landing strip of like telephone lines and whatnot. So I mean, it's a really interesting a concept, but because most of these tracks were written kind of in isolation and not as a whole, they feel very disjointed. Like the sad story of Lead and Astine was written well before a lot of this. Same with Two Rope Swing, and Two Rope Swing is probably the best track off of this. It's got something to say that it's probably the shortest. A Few Steps Down the Wrong Road is overly predictable and overly yeah, it's just a bad track. I've already gone into length about why I don't like it. Yeah, it's just a bad track. And Slow Rust being the big 20-minute track is just kind of there. So it's being touted as like the highest rated on the Prog Archives, but honestly, it is one of their worst. I did not care for that at all. As much as I, don't talk highly on it, out of these three, my favorite one is still A Spark in the Ether, The Music That Died Alone Volume 2. I was kind of hoping that they would reprise a lot of things that they put from the original, The Music That Died Alone, but it just kind of fell flat. The opening and closing track of A Spark in the Ether is a good kind of bookmark, and, the big track of The Celluloid Road, An Imaginary Travelogue, is really weak. It's essentially just a, USA travel log of all the different movies that take place in different cities, and it just doesn't go anywhere. It's just kind of a bland blech. Clearing the Attic is probably my favorite track off of this, but after Eugene, which Clearing the Attic flows right into, is a very bad ripoff of Careful with That Axe, Eugene. Like, it's a very bad ripoff. So, yeah, I don't know. The Music That Died Alone, Volume 2, didn't really spark all that excitement in me. And then we can just talk about Auto Reconnaissance, which was their last album that they put out. And yeah, this one you really want to... I don't return to this. I've listened to it a couple more times since I put out my review for it, but it is just... I don't know. Jinxed in Jersey goes on for way too long. Lie Back and Think of England, the almost 30-minute track, it's just over self-indulgent. It's all the bad things about prog that I'm not a big fan of. And it's very forgettable. And this really does go to kind of where Tangent has just fallen into that same trap of putting out the same music over and over again. And I'm just not a big fan, even though there's some really great personnel that's found on all these tracks. All of that being said and done, that's the Tangent. That's where I would start off with A Place in the Queue, not as good as the book, then go on to Proxy and Le Sac de Travail. From there, if you like what you hear, my next recommendation is checking out The Music That Died Alone, as well as The World That We Drive Through. And if all of that is good, the further readings would be Down and Out in Paris and London and Calm. I would honestly recommend avoiding A Spark in the Ether, The Music That Died Alone Volume 2, The Slow Rust of Forgotten Machinery, and Auto Reconnaissance, because at this point you know exactly what you're getting with those albums. And that's the Tangent. So I hope this helps. I hope that my diving into their discography provides some amusement for you. Let me know what you guys think about the Tangent. What are your favorite albums? What are your least favorite albums? And let me know all about that by commenting down below. As I mentioned, the Tangent really is, even with all that being said and done, one of my favorite retro prog outfits. I very regularly will return to A Place in the Queue, not as good as the book, Proxy and Le Sac de Travail, over and over and over again, and still to this day get so much reward and enjoyment out of those pieces. So I highly recommend going and checking those out. Thank you all so much for watching. If you like what you see and you want to help support me, consider donating to my Patreon. Even $1 a month really does go a long way. I've left the link, as I keep mentioning, down below. Even at $1 a month, all the tiers get something really fun, and you get your name at the end of the credits, no matter what you donate. And if you want to see more of me, I've got my podcast of Quid Prog Quo. That's where I subject my friends and loved ones to progressive rock music, and they get to send me whatever they want. That's found on YouTube, as well as wherever you listen to podcasts, as well as my role-playing game, my other side of my life. That's where it's notes on tabletop role-playing games. I talk about Dungeons & Dragons. I talk about Paranoia. I did a lengthy video on the Star Wars role-playing game, and I hope to do a few more of those. And yeah, that's what I've got. So, thank you all so much for watching. As always, you guys are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.